Now, as the name of the video implies, this is the fourth part of a story, so if you haven't seen the other parts yet, I'd highly recommend checking them out first, or this probably isn't going to make much sense to you. I'll include a link to all previous parts in the description below. And now without further ado, let's get back to the story. We start by getting a quick shot of a barren, rocky world with a large blazing sun in the sky above, before we're taken to some kind of vast underground complex and find ourselves in a giant hangar bay filled with various ships of all sizes, from small X-Wings to much larger transport and cargo ships. And among them, we see the cargo ship Poe Dameron has been piloting land and quickly be surrounded by a small, well-armed New Republic security force, who raise their weapons and point them at Poe when the ramp lowers and he begins to walk down it with his hands up. That's when we see, anxiously pushing their way past the security force and telling them to lower their weapons already, which they hesitantly do, a very well-dressed, middle-aged human male and an equally well-dressed, elderly Togruta female who all but run up to Poe, look him over for a moment, seem a little disappointed, and then look right past him at the ramp as if expecting and hoping to see someone else. That's when the well-dressed man says, "Where is she? Where's former Senator Organa?" Poe flashes a grin and says, "Yeah, about that. She's not exactly here. I mean, she's here in the system, but not here with me on this ship. But I've come on her behalf to warn you that the First Order is coming, and to get any and all of you senators to safety." To that, the elderly Togruta simply says back, "To safety? This is the safest place in the galaxy for us right now." Poe shakes his head and says, "Didn't you hear what I just said? The First Order is coming for you. Hell, one ship's already here, with no doubt more on the way." The well-dressed man nods his head and just says that, "We know." Poe, after looking at them in disbelief for a moment, then says, "You know, but you're just sitting here doing nothing about it. Who exactly is in command here anyway?" "We are," the well-dressed man says back. Poe looks back and forth between the two and says, "You two are in charge of all this." Poe then waves a hand around to indicate the massive structure that they're in, and all the troops, pilots, and ships that seem to be on standby. He then says, "Do either of you have any idea what to do?" They both shake their heads, and that's when the well-dressed man says, "When the code you broadcast turned out to be that of former Senator Organa, we thought that maybe..." "That maybe she could take over for you two?" Poe says with a grin. The two seem reluctant, but after a moment nod their heads and say nothing. Poe then continues, "Where are all the other senators?" The elderly Togruta then speaks up and says, "Most were in the Hosnian system during the attack, and those that weren't have yet to make their way here, and we're starting to fear the worst." It's then that Poe can't seem to help himself but laugh for a good long moment. He then says, "I can't believe this. It was people like you that forced her out in the first place when you learned the truth about her father. Now you'd give anything to have her back. Is that it? To hold your hand and show you the way because you have no idea how to function in anything but the peaceful galaxy she provided for you." The two senators can do nothing more than give a rather apologetic look and then shrug. Poe then continues, "And you want her back in what capacity exactly?" The well-dressed man quickly speaks up and says, "A vote would be had amongst all gathered senators to elect an emergency chancellor." He then glances briefly at the elderly Togruta, then at Poe, and gives a bit of a sheepish grin before continuing, "And something tells me that vote would be unanimous in her favor." Poe then counters, "But she's not even a senator anymore, or part of the government at all." The elderly Togruta then quickly shakes her head and says, "It doesn't matter. According to the Alderaan protocol, any qualified individual can be elected in an emergency situation, until such a time as a proper election can be held." Poe then begins, "But the galaxy hates her now thanks to all of you, and they never..." But he cuts himself off when he sees the well-dressed man shaking his head, and he then says, "Actually, she's never been more popular amongst the people. Most disgraced politicians run away and hide in obscurity for the rest of their days when something like this happens to them. But not Senator Organa. She instead found a new way to fight for the people. Against an emerging regime the New Republic turned a blind eye to, till it was too late." Poe sighs and then says, "Yeah, well, there's still a problem. Remember that First Order ship I mentioned? Last I checked, it just so happened to be attacking her ship, so unless you've got a fleet hidden somewhere..." But Poe stops himself when he notices they both have a grin on their face. That's when the well-dressed man says, "We have the ships, just no one with experience against the First Order." Poe then smiles excitedly and says, "Well, buddy, now you do." We then switch scenes and get a shot of the Millennium Falcon flying through hyperspace before we're taken inside and into the cockpit and see an impatient-looking Rey sitting there alone while resting on the console before her is the compass, still illuminated. That's when Luke enters, takes a seat next to her, shuts his eyes, and just calmly sits there without saying a word. After a few moments, the impatient Rey blurts out, "Aren't you worried about where this thing might be taking us? All I did was punch in a series of random coordinates that somehow just felt right to me." To that, Luke shakes his head and Rey frowns and then says, "How can you be so calm right now?" Luke opens his eyes, glances over at her, and simply says, "It's not about being calm. It's about having control." Once more, Luke shuts his eyes and tilts his head back and gets even more comfortable. Rey then blinks in confusion a few times before saying, "But you said the Force can't be controlled." Luke seems to think for a moment and says, "Are you sure that's what I said exactly?" Rey then nods her head and says, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is." Luke shrugs as if it doesn't really matter exactly what he said. Then, looking more relaxed than ever, he says, "The Force can be controlled, Rey, but too much control over it is the path to the dark side. The control I speak of for you is self-control, control over your thoughts and emotions, so that they don't control you." Luke is quiet for a moment, then continues, "Because of your strong connection to it, the Force is drawn to you, Rey. So you must think of yourself as a conduit, a means by which the Force can act. Only when your mind is clear of all your fears, concerns, and desires will you know how to proceed, how to carry out the will of the Force, and not just your own will." Rey says to that, looking almost a little disappointed, "So we should never use the Force for ourselves then?" Luke, keeping his eyes closed, then responds, "And just what would you use it for, Rey?" Rey then shakes her head a bit and says, I don't know. It was just a question, nothing more." But Luke's face suddenly takes on a more serious expression, and he says, "No, it wasn't, Rey. Something troubles you. I can feel it." Rey is quiet for a moment, then hesitantly begins, "And something troubles you as well, doesn't it? Even I can feel that. You weren't just waiting on that island all those years for your old masters to appear and help you. You were waiting for something else, for someone else, weren't you?" Luke responds, "This isn't about me, Rey." But Rey shakes her head to that and says, "Yes, it is. The Force sent me to you, guided me, just some scavenger, to the legendary Luke Skywalker. And I want to know why, what it means, and who you were waiting for on that island, and why you were so disappointed that you got me instead." Luke shakes his head to that and says, "That's where you're wrong, Rey. I wasn't disappointed that it was you, just surprised." Rey immediately counters, "So you were waiting for someone then?" Luke then gets to his feet and says as he looks down at her, "Right now, I should be telling you, a Jedi doesn't seek answers to questions, but trusts the Force to show them the truth in time. But believe me when I say, I understand your impatience. I've spent too much of my life looking instead of just being." That's when Rey, a pleading look on her face, asks, "Do you know who I am?" Luke, his expression sympathetic, then says, "No. And yet, maybe." As Rey tries to figure out what that might mean, Luke turns and takes a few steps towards the exit of the cockpit, but he stops himself, takes from his belt his green lightsaber, and sets it on the seat behind Rey, and then quickly and quietly walks away. Rey watches him go, and then her focus immediately shifts to the lightsaber. After a long, deep breath, she then reaches out for it. And as soon as she touches it, there is a flash, and we, along with Rey, now find ourselves on a lush, vibrant green world, watching a scene that feels vaguely familiar, yet different. We see a hooded and robed Luke Skywalker, maybe 20 years younger than we just saw him, looking at what appears to be the ruins of some type of small temple on a hillside, not too far off in the distance. From behind him, then, we watch as a robed and hooded figure approaches, who then reaches into a satchel they have, and pulls from it a lightsaber, the same one Rey just touched, and hands it in Luke's direction and says to him in a soft, feminine voice, "You'll need this back." Slowly then, Luke turns around and says to her, "No weapons or questions. Those were your two rules if I was going to be allowed to stay, and just be in this place." We then focus in on the face of the hooded woman, and see that she is rather beautiful, and around the same age as Luke. She then says, "I know that your sister called out to you, that she wants you to train her son, and I know you will answer that call." Luke, looking rather baffled, then says, "How? How did you know? How did you hear that? Who are you really, and what is this place? Why can't you answer at least some of my questions?" The woman gives the faintest of shrugs and says, There are many worlds in the galaxy like this one, worlds that the Force is drawn to, and that those who feel the Force strongly are also drawn to. Luke nods and says Dagobah was like this. So was Jakku once upon a time. The woman nods and emphasizes for Luke to take the saber she holds out to him. There is a degree of sadness on her face as she then says, "Now take it and go. Train the next generation of Jedi, and ensure their light never fades from this galaxy." But Luke shakes his head, glances over his shoulder at the ruins of the temple behind him, and says, "But I came here to learn how to train the future of the Jedi, to learn how to find and face this darkness that I felt awaken. I cannot leave here without at least some answers." Luke then reaches out, but does not take the saber from her. Instead, he takes her gently by the wrist and lowers her arm and says, "Come with me." But the beautiful woman shakes her head and whispers, "You already know that I can't." Luke averts his gaze a bit and asks, "Can't or won't?" That's when the woman takes her other hand and lays it gently upon Luke's cheek and says, "You came here seeking answers, and one day you will realize that you found them." She then smiles at him and finishes, "And one day, on a world not much different from this one, we will meet again, when you see my reflection in the eyes of another, and see yourself there as well." Luke looks utterly confused by that, and the woman takes the opportunity to place the saber in his hand, before simply turning and walking into the thick foliage and underbrush all around them. That's when everything around Rey immediately goes dark, and all the sounds of nature we were just hearing a moment ago are replaced by total silence. We then see, in the same direction the mysterious woman just walked away, the silhouette of a figure walking slowly towards Rey, and as it gets closer, we see that there is a soft bluish glow about him, as it says to her, "Rey, 2 paths are set before you now, but only you can choose which will be your destiny." And after that is when the figure comes into focus better, and we see that it's actually the Force ghost of Anakin Skywalker. But in the next instant, we hear the sound of a lightsaber igniting behind Rey, and she quickly turns around just in time to see Darth Vader there, crimson red saber raised over his head and ready to attack. Rey then crumbles to the ground before him and makes the useless gesture of shielding herself from the strike that is coming with her arms. But before the blow falls upon her, we hear the sound of another lightsaber igniting, and watch as Anakin, apparently wielding his blue saber, blocks the strike just in the nick of time. That's when the ground beneath Rey seems to give out, and we watch her fall for a moment before she finds herself on the balcony of a massive castle-like structure. And there with her we see 2 figures. One, a tall, lean, rather handsome blue-eyed humanoid figure. The other is dressed all in dark gray, and has a hood pulled low over their face. As Rey slowly gets to her feet, we, and she, notice the yellow sky above is littered with ships locked in combat with each other. And when Rey looks out over the balcony, we see a massive ground battle taking place, and many of the participants wield lightsabers of all colors, red, blue, green, and so on, though it's difficult to tell who is exactly fighting who. That's when the tall, lean figure says, "You and your knights have served me well, Ren. And now, at long last, my day of final victory is upon us." The other figure then responds in a female voice and says, "Are you so sure the victory is yours?" That's when suddenly the tall figure turns his head and seems to see Rey standing nearby, and takes a couple quick, long strides towards her with his hand extended out. Rey at first seems confused or in disbelief that he can see her, but finally she starts to back away. But that's when the figure in gray ignites a red lightsaber, and the tall figure stops and turns to face her, just in time to get slashed across the face. Rey then, still backpedaling, stumbles over her own feet, and as soon as she hits the ground, she finds herself back on board the Millennium Falcon, and the scene ends. That's when we're taken to the bridge of a First Order Star Destroyer and see General Hux, with an all too pleased expression on his face, staring out at the disabled Resistance flagship, when suddenly the boarding crafts affixed to its hull begin to detach, and other First Order transport ships are now seen leaving its hangar. Hux, first looking confused, but then quickly angry, calls out to one of his nearby officers. What are they doing? Have they begun transferring prisoners without my authorization?" The officer shakes his head and then says, "No, sir. They are reporting that repairs to the Resistance ship's hyperdrive have been completed, and that they have left only a small security force behind, and a few technicians to operate the ship and keep it secured, as ordered. Hux blinks in confusion a few times and says, "As ordered? And whose orders were they exactly?" The officer then says back, "Upon Lord Wren's departure, Commander EN 7173 assumed operational command and issued these orders." Again, Hux blinks in confusion a few times before saying, "And no one thought to question these ridiculous orders?" The officer then looks up at Hux. The expression on his face is one of bewilderment as he says, "Question the orders, sir?" Hux lets out a frustrated groan and then says, "And just where is Commander EN 7173 now?" That's when the scene quickly shifts, and we're taken into a small room aboard the Resistance ship and see the stormtrooper whose armor Finn stole tied and gagged in a corner, while BB-8 still projects a bluish beam from his eye down on the stormtrooper's datapad. We then watch as BB-8, after he makes a rather proud-sounding chirp, rolls over to a nearby terminal and uses one of his attachments to plug in, which is when the scene shifts and we're taken to the detention block aboard the Resistance ship, where two lone stormtroopers are still on patrol, and see all the force fields suddenly drop, and watch as the imprisoned Resistance members immediately rush from their cells and overwhelm the troopers. Admiral Akbar then calls out, "The droid did it, but he likely won't be able to get the ship into hyperspace. Get to the bridge, secure it, and get us out of here." We're then taken back aboard the bridge of the Star Destroyer and watch General Hux point angrily at the Resistance ship as he barks out the order to destroy it immediately. That's when another officer hesitantly speaks up and she says, "Sorry, General, but we have another problem." Hux gives something like a roll of the eyes and says while shaking his head, "Now someone wants to question orders?" The officer says back, "No, sir, it's just that a fleet of New Republic cruisers and fighters has just appeared on our scanners." Hux looks at her and says, "Just appeared?" She nods back and says, "We've been having troubles with our scanners since we entered the system. Something to do with the strange nature of this system's sun, which is probably why they chose this system in the first place." Hux gives her a blank look and says, "What brilliant insight, Lieutenant. Now raise shields, open fire, and tell all crews to get to their fighters at once." We're then taken into space just outside of Hux's Star Destroyer, which is still accompanied by 3 other Star Destroyers, and see roughly a half dozen New Republic cruisers closing fast. And out in front of them are several squadrons of X-Wings, and out in front of all of them is one lone fighter, and we see in the cockpit of that fighter none other than Poe Dameron, who then says, "Alright, each squadron take a Star Destroyer, and remember, start by hitting their hangar bays as fast as you can with proton torpedoes, and then take out their cannons so the cruisers can close in and finish the job. And remember, stay close and as tight as possible so that their turbo lasers can't get a lock on you." We then watch as the fighters separate into 4 groups and all head for a different Star Destroyer. Next, we watch as Poe's X-Wing and a few others launch a barrage of torpedoes into a hangar bay of one of the Star Destroyers just as TIE fighters had started to launch. We then watch as other X-Wings do the same to another Star Destroyer, and then briefly watch as other X-Wings start taking out the cannons affixed to the deck and underside of the Star Destroyers, while still other X-Wings take out the handful of TIE fighters that were able to launch. That's when we're taken onto the bridge of the Resistance flagship and see a handful of First Order technicians surrendering to Resistance troopers. Then Admiral Akbar walks onto the bridge, looks around triumphantly, before looking out a viewport and seeing the battle taking place beyond. Another Resistance officer then tentatively says, "Sir, ready to make the jump to hyperspace on your command." But Akbar shakes his head and says, "Belay that order, Lieutenant, and turn us around. Battle stations, everyone." We're then taken back out into space, where we watch Poe's X-Wing make a quick strafing run across the deck of a Star Destroyer that takes out several cannons, before we're taken into the cockpit of his ship and see him notice the Resistance flagship turning around as it begins to open fire on the Star Destroyers. Poe then smiles to himself, punches a button, and says, "Glad to see you joining the fight, General. I knew you'd find a way to deal with those First Order thugs." But that's when Poe hears back the voice of Admiral Akbar say, "Sorry, Commander Dameron, but General Organa is no longer on board and has been taken prisoner." Poe's smile instantly vanishes as he responds, "Wait, what? Where is she exactly? On one of the Star Destroyers?" Akbar says back, "Negative. She was taken elsewhere on a First Order command shuttle, but don't worry, we'll get her back. Finn was with her, and your droid implanted a tracker into his new robotic spine that hopefully they won't be able to detect." That's when we switch scenes, and we watch as Kylo Ren's command shuttle comes out of hyperspace above a gray world covered by swirling storm clouds, the same one we saw earlier in the story. In orbit above it are still several First Order Star Destroyers, though seemingly fewer than there were the last time we were here. That's when we're taken into the shuttle and see Kylo Ren, helmet on, standing over a seated and restrained Leia and Finn has been stripped of his stolen armor and now just wears the black undersuit. Kylo then says, looking at Finn, "Today you receive an honor few troopers of such low rank ever do, meeting the Supreme Leader." Finn snaps back, "I'm not one of your troopers anymore, Ren." Kylo leans down a bit closer and says, "No, but you're going to wish you were. You're going to wish you had never defied the First Order and our Supreme Leader." Finn, a proud, fearless look on his face, then says, "I'd rather be dead than still be part of his army." Kylo nods and says, "Soon then, you shall have your wish." That's when Leia speaks up and says, "You don't have to do this, Ben." Kylo then quickly turns his head and looks at Leia and says, "I've told you, Ben Solo is gone. He was destroyed by your lies, and then shown the truth and given new purpose by the one chosen to bring lasting order to the galaxy, by the one chosen to end this fight once and for all." Leia shakes her head in confusion, but then, suddenly, the look on her face completely changes, and it's hard to tell if she now looks hopeful or more worried than ever. A moment later, Kylo inclines his head upward and looks around briefly before saying, "He is coming, and she is with him." That's when we switch scenes and get a shot of the Millennium Falcon flying through hyperspace before we're taken on board and see Luke Skywalker seated cross-legged, eyes closed, on a dingy, uncomfortable-looking bunk. When his eyes slowly open, we and he see Rey standing before him. That's when we watch Rey set the lightsaber down and Luke says, "I trust it showed you what I expected then. I trust it showed you her." Rey nods her head and says, "Who was she? Why did I feel connected to her?" Luke takes a deep breath and says, "I think you know why." Rey, slightly annoyed by that response, says, "Do I? Is it the same reason I feel connected to you? The same reason why I was led to you?" Luke shuts his eyes and lowers his head. He then asks, "Was she all it showed you?" To that, Rey shakes her head and says, "I want you to answer my question first. Why was I really led to you? You said you hoped I wasn't what you were waiting for on that island because of what it would mean for me. What did you mean by that?" To that, Luke says, "Search your feelings, Rey. All the answers you seek are already there. Now tell me, what else did it show you?" Rey doesn't look like she wants to answer, but just when it looks like she will, Luke rises to his feet and looks like he senses something. Rey just stares at him in confusion, and a moment later, the ship comes out of hyperspace, and he and Rey exchange a look as if they both now sense something ominous. That's when we hear the roar of Chewie echo from elsewhere in the ship, and a second later, the ship is hit by laser fire and both Rey and Luke run for the cockpit. When they reach it, they find Chewbacca punching away frantically at the controls as we see they are now approaching a grayish world covered in storm clouds. And in orbit above it, of course, are several Star Destroyers that have already opened fire on them and have launched TIE fighters to intercept. "Get us back into hyperspace," Rey shouts as she jumps in the pilot seat. Chewie roars something in return, and Rey responds, "It doesn't matter where, just get us out of here." That's when Luke, the look on his face overcome by curiosity, suddenly says, "No, make for the planet." Rey and Chewie both look at him like he's crazy. Chewie roars something angrily, and Rey says, "Chewie's right. What are we going to do about the waves of TIE fighters heading for us?" Luke calmly responds then, "Leave them to me," before we see him quickly walk out of the cockpit and make for the ladder that leads to the upper and lower turret. For a moment, Luke glances up at the turret Han manned so many years ago and gives a faint smile and says, "Don't worry, old friend. I'll make sure this hunk of junk holds together at least a little longer." The scene then shifts, and we're taken back aboard Kylo Ren's command shuttle and see Kylo standing in the cockpit, watching as far off in the distance waves of TIEs approach the Millennium Falcon, only to quickly get blown to pieces after landing only a few shots that are, slowly but surely, taking their toll on the Falcon. Kylo then says to his pilots, "Follow that ship." Which is when the scene shifts to a different part of the shuttle, where Finn and Leia are seated together, still restrained, and being closely watched by the 7 Knights of Ren. Leia then leans closer to Finn and whispers, "When the time comes, break your restraints and go and find Rey." Finn responds by looking at her like she's completely lost her mind and says, "What, just break my restraints, huh? And how should I do that? With the Force or something? Because let me tell you, that's not how the Force works." Leia gives him a gentle smile and says, "I know a little something about how the Force works, Finn. I also know a little something about how that new spine we gave you works. When the time comes, it'll give you the strength you need, trust me." For a moment, Finn looks excited by that prospect. He then quickly looks grim again and says, "Hold up, what do you mean, find Rey?" Leia doesn't exactly answer that question, and instead says, "She's going to need you, Finn. I can feel it." Finn is about to say something else to that, but one of the Knights of Ren steps forward and holds a bladed weapon to Finn's throat and says, "Be silent. Our master has instructed us that no harm must come to the last princess of Alderaan, but he said nothing about you, traitor." That's when we again switch scenes, and we're taken back into the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon, and watch as both Rey and Chewbacca struggle with the controls as they plunge into the storm clouds that encircle the planet. Rey then cries out, seeing nothing but gray, "I can't see anything on the scopes, and those ties decimated the thrusters. Even if I could see, I don't know if I could land this thing." Moments later, we see the Falcon emerge from the clouds and watch as it is nosediving right for the surface of the gray, barren, storm-ravaged world below. That's when, back in the cockpit now, we see Luke enter once more, his eyes closed and his hand extended out. We then watch as the Falcon begins to right itself and slow down quite a bit, just moments before it slams into and slides across the surface of the planet. When it comes to a skidding halt, we watch as another ship, Kylo Ren's command shuttle, breaks through the cloud cover above and begins to descend towards the surface, not far from where the Falcon has come to a stop. We're then quickly taken back into the cockpit of the Falcon and see Luke lying on the floor looking unconscious, just as Rey and Chewie seem to come to and get their wits about them again. At first, Rey sees Kylo Ren's shuttle landing nearby, which is when she looks around in panic before quickly spotting Luke, and then immediately hops out of her seat, crouches over him, takes him by the hand and says, "Please wake up, please, we need you." Luke's eyes then flutter open, and he gives her a slight smile before saying, "You have to go now, Rey. You have to get out of here. You're not ready for this fight. So run, and keep running until I come and find you, or..." "Or what?" Rey says as the tears start to well up in her eyes. Luke then answers, "Or you find another way off this planet, another way to learn the ways of the Force and finish this fight once and for all." Rey shakes her head adamantly and says, "No, I'm not leaving you. I've waited my whole life for my family." Luke gives a single nod of the head and says, "And you have to understand that, Jedi or not, my friends and my family mean everything to me, which is why you have to go, and why I have to face him." Rey wants to argue against that, but before she can say anything, Luke simply says, "Chewie," at which point the massive Wookiee jumps to his feet, scoops up Rey as if she were little more than a sack of feathers, and begins to carry her away while she screams out to let her go and put her down. That's when R2 rolls into the cockpit, and Luke gives him an approving nod before saying, "See what you can do with the ship, buddy. Hopefully, I'll be back for it soon." We're then taken outside the ship and see the ramp of the Falcon lower, and Chewie, still carrying Rey, races down it and out into the raging storm and into a forest of tall, dead, skeletal trees that is all around them. Moments later, the ramp to Kylo's shuttle lowers, and he quickly strides down it, followed by his knights, and sees Chewie holding Rey race off into the dead woods. Kylo says over his shoulder to the knight who earlier earned his lightsaber, "Find them, kill the Wookiee, but show her the truth." The Knight of Ren nods and waves for the others to follow him as they quickly run off in the same direction as Rey and Chewie. That's when Kylo sees, walking slowly down the ramp of the Millennium Falcon, Luke Skywalker. And as Luke calmly and confidently walks across the muddy ground, the sky being illuminated by near constant lightning, Kylo begins to walk towards Luke. And when the two are but a few paces apart, both stop and simply look at each other. And that is where this part ends. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this part of the story and how you think it might end. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.